Hey guys, I'm Dave and welcome to the Trull Gallery. Today, we're going to make a tray using some handmade Sicilian tiles. A friend of mine recently brought some handmade tiles back from a trip to Sicily, and she asked me to make a tray out of them. I only have one tile to spare, so I have to be careful. Let's see if I can actually pull this off. These are the tiles I have to work with. They're handmade, uneven, have wonky edges, and 3 of them have hanging wires on the top edge that have to go. Did I mention that I only have one to spare, so I have to work carefully. I thought my best bet to remove the hanging wire was to use the cutoff wheel on my Dremel tool. I gently clamped the tile down with a quick grip clamp, cut one leg of the loop, and then cut the second leg. I worked carefully and cut the wires as close to the tile as possible so it wouldn't interfere when I set the tiles in place. Good news, all the wires were cut cleanly and there was no damage to any tiles. Next, I went over to my miter saw to cut 4 pieces of aluminum tile edge, or Schluter strips. I use that to surround the tile on the substrate. This is thin aluminum extrusion and can easily be cut with standard woodworking tools. Just go slowly. I made a 45-degree miter cut on each of the 4 pieces, clamping each piece down for the cut. I also stayed well clear of the right side of the blade in case any small bits of aluminum went flying. After determining the length I'd need, and doing some head scratching, I changed the miter saw setup. I added a secondary fence that was long enough to attach a stop block to. That stop block was cut at 45 degrees to match the angle of the pieces I'd already cut. Before each cut, I made sure to knock off any burrs from the previous miter, ensuring the strips would seat fully against the stop. Then I could make the second miter cut on the opposite end. Since the tiles will create a square, all 4 Schluter strips were cut to the same size. I decided to use 1/2-inch birch plywood as my base. It's stable, the bottom will look nice, and I have a ton of it in my shop. At the table saw, I cut the plywood 3/4 of an inch wider than the aluminum Schluter square. I switched my plywood blade for a 1/2-inch dado set and put on my sacrificial fence to prevent the blade and the saw fence from touching. I set the blade height to leave 1/4 of an inch of material and set the fence to cut a 3/8 inch wide rabbet. The tape on the plywood is there to minimize tear out, especially on the cross-grained cuts. If you'd like to see a more in-depth explanation, I'll add a link to my video where I explain how to get clean cuts on not great plywood. Now we could run the rabbet on each side of the plywood, making sure to press down firmly to get a consistent depth. And when it doesn't hurt to run each side twice, just in case. The frame for this tray is red oak to match the shelves at my friend's house. I had some strips of red oak available, so I started at the miter saw and cut them to rough length. I left them about 2 inches longer than I think I need, so I'd have some room to work later. Back at the table saw, I ripped the oak to width. I wanted the plywood to sit up about 1/8 of an inch up from the bottom, and the tiles to sit about 1/2 inch below the top of the frame. After measuring the thickness of the tile, the plywood, and the spacing, that gave me a width of 1 5/8. To leave me some stock for cleanup, I set my fence at 1 11/16. A few light passes through the planer and the machine marks were all gone, and I brought the stock down to its final dimension. Back at the table saw, I cut the groove for the bottom plywood. I usually switch to a dado set, but since I was just cutting a few grooves, I decided to use my rip blade. The first cut was made 3/8 of an inch deep and 5/8 of an inch up from the bottom. After running all the stock, I adjusted the fence to cut the bottom of the 1/4 inch wide groove. You can see there's a thin strip of stock still in the center. You can either clean that out with a chisel or, like I did, bump the fence over just a hair and make one more pass. Using my palm router and an 1/8 inch roundover bit, I gave the inside edges a quick cleanup. Since the stock is fairly narrow, I kept a second strip next to the one I was routing to help support the router. The outer edges will get the same detail, but I'll wait until after the frame is assembled. With that done, I could sand the strips with my random orbit sander, removing any machine marks and preparing them for finishing. I started at 120 grit and worked my way up to 220 grit until everything was all cleaned up. It'd be difficult to get a nice finish on the inside of the frame after it's assembled, so I chose to pre-finish them now. I'm using a water-based stain, and I make sure to work it into the open grain of the oak. The first coat was a little lighter than I'd hoped, so I let that dry and then added a second coat later. Just make sure to wipe off any excess drips, as they can look a bit like paint once they're dry. While I didn't film it, I also added a coat of clear urethane, but I made sure to tape off any parts that had not yet been stained. I also gave the plywood a coat of urethane on both sides, just to seal it before moving forward. Once the urethane was dry, I could slip the frame sides onto the bottom and mark the space inside. This would be my layout lines for the next slightly unorthodox step. I taped my Schluter frame together and carefully set it on the lines I had just drawn. Then, working one side at a time, I used some thick CA glue and fixed the aluminum to the base. With the first side set, I could check the opposite side for square and glue that down. The other two sides went down the same way. Now for another slightly unorthodox technique. Rather than use thin set to adhere the tiles, I use some high-strength construction adhesive. This particular adhesive is rated for indoor and outdoor use and will bond with most anything. Since the tiles are uneven, I put a healthy bead on the back of each one and set the tiles in place. I made sure to match the layout my friend had asked for, starting in the corners first. These tiles have no straight edges, so I have to work by eye. Once the corners are set, I can eyeball the 4 outer tiles, keeping the spacing as even as possible. Finally, I added the center tile, again working to keep things as even as I could. In an attempt to keep the tile faces on one plane, I used my grout float to seat the tiles as evenly as possible. And just in case, I added a second sheet of plywood on top and lightly clamped the 4 corners. I'm not sure if this was necessary, but I figured I'd give it a shot. This adhesive has a 24-hour cure time, so I set the assembly aside for the weekend. After letting the adhesive set up for a few days, it was time for grout. I mixed up a small batch of sanded grout and started to work it into all the spaces. I kept my grout float at about 45 degrees, forcing the grout in until all the lines were filled. Then I could remove any excess grout, again keeping my float at 45 degrees. This is a good time to look for any voids and work more grout into those areas. I let the grout sit for a few minutes and then came back with a damp but almost dry sponge to clean off the excess. I rotate the sponge often, keeping a clean edge for each pass. Then I rinse out the sponge before coming back again. I'm not only removing the excess grout, but this also helps to smooth out the grout lines. Once everything looks clean, I let it dry, this time for about 15 minutes. There's still a bit of haze on the tiles, so I wipe everything down again. I also double check for any gaps or air bubbles in the grout and smooth out any I find. One more wipe down after another 15 minutes and the tiles and grout look great. Again, I set the assembly aside to let it dry overnight before moving on to the next step. The first step in framing the tiles was to cut a miter on one end of the 4 oak strips. Again, watch out for flying debris. It always seems a bit more dramatic when trimming small pieces at an angle. To ensure I was cutting to the correct length, I cut one of the pieces with the second miter, but left it long. Now I could sneak up on the fit with another piece, adjusting my stop block until the test piece fit snugly. Then it was back to the miter saw to cut the other 3 pieces to length. If you'll notice, I always clamp my stock down when cutting at an angle. This prevents the blade from drawing the material into the cut, changing the angle. With all the pieces cut to size, I did a dry assembly to make sure that everything looked good. Then I could come back and add glue to both sides of each corner, since the end grain tends to suck up a lot of the moisture. With all the ends glued, I could assemble the frame and clamp everything together. I double-checked to make sure that all my corners were tight, and then I cleaned off any glue squeeze out. With the glue dry, I gave the outer frame a quick sanding and then grabbed my palm router with that same 1/8" roundover bit and cleaned up the outer edges, both top and bottom. I left the corners square and will just ease them during the final sanding. Miter joints are not known for their strength, so I'll add a spline to each corner. I'll use this jig made up of several layers of 3/4" plywood with opposing 45-degree angles. I set my fence to run a curve in the middle of my frame stock and adjust the depth so the blade would be just shy of penetrating the inner side of the frame. I don't want to hit the tiles inside. Now we can set the frame into the jig and run a curve in each of the 4 corners. I ripped a piece of oak to just over 1/8 inch thick and long enough to give me 4 splines and some left over just in case. I often use contrasting woods for my splines, but these are for strength and not for decoration. I want the tiles to be the focus of this piece. I clamped a piece of scrap stock to the planer to help support the thin stock and then took a light pass. That one pass worked out to be just right, giving me a snug but not too tight fit. Back at the miter saw, I cut 4 pieces of the spline to about 2 inches long. That would be long enough to fill the corner slots and leave some excess stock hanging out. I add a little glue to the corner and tapped in the first spline. The key here is to make sure it's fully seated and not leaving any gaps. Then I could rotate the frame and add the rest of the splines one at a time. After seating the first 2 splines, I set the frame on some scrap stock so that those splines wouldn't hit the tabletop while setting the last 2. After an hour or so, I came back with my flush cutting saw and trimmed off the excess splines. Waiting allows the glue to cure and is less likely to gum up the fine teeth on the saw. And make sure you work carefully so you don't cut into the sides of the frame. One last sanding with my random orbit sander, starting at 150 grit and finishing with 220 grit, gets rid of any last scratches and the frame is ready for staining. Before I started staining, I completely taped off all the tiles and put 1 strip of tape on the perimeter of the bottom plywood. This will prevent the stain from getting anywhere it's not supposed to be. Then I could stain it as before, working the stain into the open grain and wiping off any excess. Again, I let that sit for a few hours and came back with a second coat to get the color close to what I was going for. I gave the piece 3 coats of water-based urethane and carefully sand in between coats by hand with 220 grit paper. If you blow through the urethane and the stain, you can do a little touch-up with an artist brush before the final coat. As long as you're careful, it'll never show. I intended to do this final step before building the frame around the tile, but better late than never. It's time to seal the grout. I like these small bottles with the included brush, even when I'm working on a much larger area. It's easy to use. You just flood the grout lines with the sealer and then let it sit for about 5 minutes. Then you can come back with a clean cloth or a paper towel and wipe off any excess. Let that first coat sit for about half an hour and repeat the process. The final cure time for the sealer is about 48 hours, so try not to walk on your tray before that. Or try not to spill any wine on it until then. I think this tray came out great, and all those little imperfections on those handmade tiles just add to the charm. And while this tray is only about 14 inches square, like all things tile, it's got some weight to it. One of the things I really like is the way that the splines add a lot of strength to these miter joints, but yet they still just blend into the frame itself. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this project. Was there something I could have done differently, smarter, safer, different products perhaps? Drop them in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, maybe share it with friends and give us a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, maybe it's time to hit the subscribe button and the little bell so you get notified each time I put out a new video. As usual, I'm not real sure what's coming up next, but it should be interesting. So until then, have a great day. We'll see you soon. Take care.